Hi, welcome to another video on Vadi's guards, this time part 2 of the middle guards. There's probably going to be a part 3, but I'm going to do a very Vadi thing, which is to go away, talk about a bunch of other stuff that you need to know, and then come back to part 3. Because there's a lot of other theory that's required to fully understand them. But today I want to talk about what I consider to be the primary uses of the middle guards, which are control and defense. And I'm going to first talk about the control, especially the control of measure, because that's one of the things that Vadi talks about, one of the guards, and says explicitly that I didn't mention in the last video. Well, I mentioned what he said, but I didn't elaborate on it. So, guard of the lady, right? If you recall, over your front foot, right? And we have variance, left, right, all this, right? Fine. Vadi tells us that it conceals the length of the sword, right? That's his kind of more or less literal version of what he says it's good at, right? And that's something that's kind of worth exploring. I think it's true. I think he's right? So if I'm standing in this guard, right, essentially what it seems to be quite good for, one of the things it seems to be quite good for, is confusing my opponent's perception of measure. Why is an interesting question. Guy Windsor, in his book, thinks it's because the eye is worse at working out a vertical than a forward, maybe, right? But then surely diagonal guards might have some difference as well. I think partly, and if that's true, right, and then actually this would also be true of crown, right, the pair on the left. And I think it's kind of true of crown, but it's less true. I think another reason why this kind of disguises people's perception of measure, which is what this really means, right, it's confusing people's ability to work out where you are, right, is that we tend to look at the sword and use that to judge the measure. Vadi tells us to do explicitly. If we see where the sword is over my front foot, right, this is just easiest to demonstrate this way. This is easily a foot less. So I foot further forward, right, than if it's over my back foot. But actually my reach from this guard or this guard is the same. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Let's try it from here. Right, here versus here. Right, exactly the same. So by bringing it on the front foot, suddenly people were reading your measure from back here, even when you're here. And thus they tend to kind of confuse where you are, which is why I think it's better than Corona for doing this. But both of them have this feature, especially when you look at them with the other middle guards, of essentially drawing people in, right? This feels unthreatening. This feels unthreatening. This feels very threatening, right? And again, we can play with perception and measure. My reach from here and here is pretty much the same. If anything, I've got more reach from here because it's easier to do kind of big, cutting, explosive movements in. But consistently, point forward guards make people think that you're closer than you are. Point up guards make you think that you're further away than you are. And you can use the middle guard this way for making these kind of very quick guard changes that you can use to confuse people's perception of measure. If I'm just standing here, no one's going to get fooled. But if I also pair it with steps, right? Okay, we can start confusing things. We can start making people start thinking, okay, hang on a sec, what's going on? And we're moving around, we're changing direction, we're doing all that kind of stuff as well to disguise measure. And then using these, if I want someone to back away, point forward. If I want someone to close in, point up, lure them in. Obviously, like low guards and high guards can kind of do that as well. Low guards also are quite good for luring people in. But note as well, right, switching between low and point forward, low and point up to a lesser extent is also super easy and super quick. So you can use them together to do that. Well, I'll probably talk about that more in a later video. Another element of control that I'm not going to talk about too much because I really need to talk about the concept of advantage and guard, and I want to do a whole video on that. But the nice thing about the middle guards, as I described before, they're already kind of blocking a line of attack, right? So we can use them. All guards are blocking a line of attack, but they're blocking particularly likely ones. So we can use them to shut down options. We can say, okay, I don't want to be hit here, so I'm going to start in this guard, right? And now no one in the stability dumb is going to attack me there. The middle guards are particularly good for this kind of control. Like, I'm not going to go about it too much because, as I say, I want to do a whole video on guard advantage, which will go through that with all the guards and show how they compare. And then the third and final thing I want to talk about today is this defensive properties of the middle guards and their main use, as I say, as parrying guards. And that's true of all of them. But they parry different things, and I think that's kind of the real thing I want to get across today. And in parrying different things, they set up different counterattacks. Right? So the point up guards. I lied, this isn't the last thing I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about one other thing afterwards. The point up guards are particularly good for covering kind of middle to high lines of attack, right? You know, anything coming from my head, point up guards, you're pretty much going to get a nice strong crossing on the middle to the bottom of the sword, right? And they're really nice for this kind of quick, especially if someone's doing like cuts to either side, you have much less distance to move, just kind of switching between the middle guards. This is the, for those that do small sword, this is the reverse of Hope's new method. Upside down Hope's new method. And you can do that, right? It's nice and easy. The downside, though, as I'm sure you can see, is that my hands super vulnerable, right? Maybe not super vulnerable, but it's very easy for cuts to kind of sneak around them. Middle cuts, so horizontal cuts and rising cuts particularly, just kind of like you think you're covered, oh no, it was a slightly wrong angle. Quite common to try and parry and accidentally eat a sword with the hands. The nice thing about the parries as well, right, as I said in the last video, the point up guards, right, are incredibly versatile striking guards. So I've parried a cut coming in, yeah, I can do this obvious. I can attack here or here. The rising strike, if I feel like it, still keeping relatively safe, right? And you'll note that, especially with those weirder strikes, right, it's actually quite easy to just do the strike, come back to the middle guard. I'm going to come back to that concept in a second, keep you nice and covered. While the strikes themselves are obviously, the weird strikes are obviously less well structured, less logical, they're also less expected. So you can often sneak around a guard using them. So, nice and versatile counterattack options, bad at covering the hands. Generally bad at covering rising strikes. Point forward guards, right, are the very opposite of that. Point forward guards, they're less good at covering the head, except for if you use them as a counter thrust, right? That's the exception for that. They're great for counter thrusts. Thrust, in general, we thrust to the point forward. Well, we thrust to the point forward guards. It's not in general, that's where we thrust to. So if you're coming for kind of high attacks, you want to defend with the point forward guards, it really is counter thrust is your main option. But where they really excel, and what you really need them for, is parrying rising cuts, right? You need to come down kind of on top of a sword to defeat a rising cut. When you come to that crossing, it's a super strong crossing, right? They're basically not able to push you out of it. Because I mentioned this before, the leverage of being on top of a sword and the benefits of gravity mean that you have the power in that crossing, right? No one's pushing you out of it, even if they're twice your size. So great at kind of coming down. You'll note this brings a cross guard into effect for covering the hands, right? So if I kind of parry like that, it doesn't do any good. But if I'm parrying edge downwards, right, in either way, again, in either structure, right, my hands are nicely covered, so that kind of sneaky attacks to the hands, horizontal riding strikes, point forward, point down guards are really good for. Again, though, they're less versatile, they're counterattack options, and you really charge this thrust. I mentioned in the last video that the obviousness of the middle guard's thrust is a weakness, because it's very obviously going to do it. This is much less true when you're using it as a counterattack, because you kind of come straight into it, right? You're in a powerful bind where they have no leverage against you, and it doesn't matter, they can see it coming because you maintain that bind as you come in with the thrust. And tough shit, right? They can't really deal with it. So you need them both, right? Because here, these are much better at defending my head, which are nice common targets. These are much better at defending low-line targets. While I've got loads of options of counterattacking from here, I kind of need that because I don't have such a strong bind. If I'm always doing this, it's actually relatively straightforward for someone to defend, right? Versus here, fine, it's my obvious move, but it's an obvious move that is really difficult to block. There is one disadvantage of them defensively, which is they are much better at defending against cuts than thrusts. So both the point forward and the point up guards can be vulnerable to thrusts in different ways. It can be quite difficult, especially if you're not stepping, to generate enough power to displace a really firm thrust by doing this kind of small motion, right? Stepping can help. Delivering it as a cut can help as a kind of a beat downwards, right? But it's quite easy for a thrust to sneak around and sort of catch your sword for all of these because you're presenting the point, right? For point forward guards, that's even more so. You can do, what rapierists call finding the blade. You can just kind of, bring your sword onto theirs, your sword onto their weak and kind of push through. But for both point up, point forward guards, thrusts are their vulnerability. So you need to keep that in mind, especially because you're closing a line of attack here. The worst is if you think you close this, and I've closed this for a cut, but a thrust is still visible, right? And this is even harder than coming here for a thrust defense. So the defensive properties are not perfect. As I say, much better for defending against people who are doing cuts than people who are doing thrusts. And you might want to consider using a different guard, especially if someone is very, 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 very stabby. Last point I want to make about the middle guards, right? Which is that using these defensive properties, they're also the most useful guards for retreat and recovery. So you've done your attack. Maybe it landed, maybe it didn't. And you want to not be hit back. The middle guards tend to be ones that you can snap to quite easily from whatever position you're in, right? And back the fuck away. So I see a lot of people cut in, retreat in a low guard. I see a lot of people cut in, retreat in something like a really head-high ox. This is very common in German fences. And with both of those, you're very open. And the recovery tends to happen then that you're running away and you get hit on the way out. Right? Again, whether it's after blow or whether you just missed, doesn't matter. Both times you've done something stupid. So my best advice for people often when they're struggling with afterblow or anything like that is, okay, you've done a strike, you're not sure what's happening. If in doubt, recover to middle guard. The high guard, the point forward up guards, I think are a better instinct than the point forward guards because they cover more. But at the same time, the ideal is the one that matches to where your opponent's sword is. So the rule of thumb I like to give is that if I've cut in and I want to recover, I'm chasing the sword. If the sword's here, fine, I'm coming to my left and up. If the sword's down there, I'm going to cover it. And likewise, my sword's here, whatever it happens to be, right? Not a perfect rule of thumb because they can do something weird. The nice thing about the middle guards is changing is normally pretty quick, right? So maybe you can react, maybe you can't. But at least you're coming to a nice tight guard where there's a possibility of reacting versus if I've kind of come to ox, and I'm using ox because this is the German, we don't have this in Vadi. If I'm really covering up the head, high ox, and someone decides to go low, you've got really far to go. Coming to this side, you're really kind of screwed, particularly kit and all that kind of stuff. So again, in summary, for this last video of this round for the middle guards, to bring this all together, right? Really good versatile guards for attacking from, especially the point up guards. Really nice guards for kind of controlling people's perceptions of measure, for kind of making people back away or come closer, for covering angles of attack to stop them from striking perfectly to certain targets. Fantastic defensive guards in terms of parrying to them. Most parries are to them, not all parries. I'll do a whole parrying video. But most parries are to the middle guards, and particularly excellent guards for recovery because of how much they cover and how easy it is to transition from one to the other if you got the line of recovery wrong. Thanks for watching. As I say, there's probably going to be a third video on the middle guards, but I'm going to wait on that one. We're going to talk about the high guards next, and I'm going to give some theory about tempo and other things before we come back to the middle guards and explain some of the wider and special properties, which really make you understand why they fit together as a category, even though there are differences between point up and point forward.